Welcome everybody. We have some attendees filing in at the top of the hour. We appreciate you joining us. We have a jam-packed webinar ready for you today. I am Grace Johnson. I am the marketing coordinator here at Wheelhouse DMG. And today we have for you Mastering the New Healthcare Search. You can go ahead and hit next there, Joe. All right, so before we dive into our content today, I want to talk a little bit about Wheelhouse and what we are about. We've been delivering performance for privacy-first brands for more than 12 years. You can see some of those brands here. And we have been working with some of the world's most innovative brands for even longer. And when it comes to our work at Wheelhouse, you can see that we provide a variety of services, but we have the most success when we tackle challenges from an all-inclusive perspective. And that's what we call our One Wheelhouse approach to privacy-first digital marketing. So all of these services can come together to really create a holistic digital marketing strategy that puts privacy at the forefront. And today we have Joe Volk, who will be leading us through our webinar. And Joe has been with us for 7 years and specializes in inbound marketing, content strategy, content design, SEO, and leading client engagements and acquisition. And I really can't think of a better person to lead you on this topic today. Joe is an exceptional member here at Wheelhouse. He is a great thought leader and really has a lot of insightful information to share on the new healthcare search. So with that, I will pass it over to Joe.
Thanks, Grace. So this is going to be a pretty broad topic we're taking on today. And partly that's because the nature of search and discovery itself has changed and has broadened. So at this point, if you want to master search for healthcare, it's not as simple as just going very, very deep on Google. You have to understand a wider range of things. So we're going to try to walk through as much depth as we have time for some of the things you should be thinking about as you look at a wider range of platforms. And then we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A, and you can follow up with me more with more specific questions you have as well. So the first way to kind of, I think, start getting into this topic is to think about two themes here, the patient journey and the diversified search landscape. To start with the second half of that phrase first, we're going to look and think a little bit about how AI and other factors have changed search and discovery. We've talked about this in other webinars and other content we've put out, and it's been something that's been a consistent theme in my conversations with clients. We are in a period of diversification. We're in a period of more different types of interfaces and more different types of platforms being relevant to digital marketing for healthcare. A lot of this is because of AI. AI has not only transformed the interfaces on Google platforms and Meta platforms, but it's also led to a new class of tools. We've all seen the stats about how quickly those tools are being adopted. We all probably have a more nuanced understanding of how much they do or don't move the needle with our specific demographic. But even beyond AI, I think a lot of folks that are focused on channels like SEO have been seeing diversification coming. We've been seeing that more people are searching on social platforms maybe than were in the past. We're also seeing that different kinds of people have more idiosyncratic or more demographic specific patterns of search and discovery. The thing is, you can say diversify, 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 but actually doing it is hard. And a lot of folks that will talk broadly about this topic don't give you a lot of concrete ideas about how to start going into it. And hopefully we'll provide some of those concrete ideas or some of the threads you can pull on more in this presentation. Another factor here is that we see all the differences in how platforms reward different types of content, different formats, and how they translate engagement differently. That's just something that no one person can perfectly memorize every single aspect of it. But it's good to just kind of get a basic frame of reference. That's something we're going to try to provide in this presentation as well. And then there's really kind of the big question looming over all of these changes we see, which is, what would a comprehensive yet strategically focused approach look like? What does it look like to try to play everywhere that it's relevant for you to play, but to do so in a way that is a consistent strategy and that is well thought through? So to answer that question, we tend to turn to a pretty flexible but foundational framework. This is something that should be familiar to anyone who works in healthcare marketing or marketing, period. The patient's journey, basically a healthcare specific variation on the buyer's journey. And this at least starts to put a frame around what are the questions we're asking, what are the problems we're trying to solve as we look at different kinds of opportunities on different kinds of platforms. So for our presentation today as well, we're going to talk through the differences and nuances we see in awareness versus consideration versus decision. At the awareness stage, obviously, we're talking about a very broad set of people asking a broad set of questions, and we're looking at really informational search. In healthcare, this often means that people are turning to search or social or AI to ask questions about diagnoses and symptoms, to try to translate something they're feeling or something they've heard from a healthcare provider to next steps and to understanding options. Those options and next steps start to sort of become more clear in the consideration stage. That's where folks, that is probably a smaller set of more qualified users, are trying to actually understand, okay, you know, we see people over here offering this service. I see someone in my neighborhood advertising this service. I see, you know, ads on my TV talking about this device class or medication class. What's really right for me? What are the core value propositions? What are voices that I trust saying? All of that occurs at the consideration stage. Finally, at the decision stage, we're talking about high intent users. We're talking about folks that are trying to take action, that they're at least considering it, and with kind of the right user journey and the right convincing, they can, you know, book an appointment, submit a form, sign up for a trial. This is the place where really our KPIs as marketers are normally going to be most strongly linked. And especially as we see more and more uncertainty happening at the highest levels of information, you know, people asking just sort of FAQs and basic queries, that those interfaces have changed a lot. In some ways, we'll look at in the coming slides. Getting people to decision stages and having strategies that actually translate to qualified traffic becomes more and more important. So again, this isn't rocket science. This is pretty 101, but I think how you apply this framework and how you think through each different aspect of it is that's the path towards having a comprehensive, broad approach that also is strategic and translates to real value. So let's look at each of these stages one by one and think about what a diversified search landscape, what we're sort of sometimes talk about as the new search looks like. This slide is a great slide for you to screenshot or come back to when we send out these materials. I don't expect it, you know, everyone to grasp all this immediately, and I'm certainly not going to read every single word on this slide. But at the awareness stage, rather, we can see that there's kind of a common trend across all these platforms of measuring some kind of awareness or engagement, rather, like that platforms are trying to reward content that people like. The issues there, like that key algorithm factors column, there's more commonality there. But the how users discover column and the best content types column, there's more variety there. So it takes some doing and some critical thinking and research to understand what specific algorithms understand or translate as high quality. You could say sort of what's legible to the algorithm, and what kinds of formats, tactics, etc., are most likely to drive specific engagement metrics. You can see maybe the shape of a repurposing strategy here. If you're used to thinking in those terms, you can see that, okay, if we have short form video on one platform and longer video on another platform and blog posts on another, can't a long video get broken up into short form videos and also summarize in text as a blog post? Sure, yeah, that is probably the beginning of a more mature way to approach this problem. But it becomes a little bit more complicated than that when we think about the fact that these different channels and different interfaces provide different kinds of opportunities for different kinds of brands. So I think part of the challenge here is to really imagine and think critically about what would be the strength or weakness of the company you work for, the company that you contract for, that would make some of these channels more approachable than others. And what I really want to do in this section is not just talk through this table, but show you some screenshots that I think are representative screenshots of the kinds of user experiences, ranking factors, etc., that should be factored into your strategy at the awareness stage. So for my screenshots here, I use sleep apnea. You'll see this in kind of all three stages. The reason I chose sleep apnea is because it's a pretty common health condition that has a wide range of ways it can be treated. Folks can go see a doctor. They can see general practitioners or specialized doctors. They can also self-serve with a variety of different devices that are available through e-commerce. So in terms of health conditions, this is pretty wide open. There's a lot of different types of figures and brands that are competing for these eyeballs. So starting first with Google, what happens when we type in sleep apnea symptoms to Google? Well, right away on this SERP, we see one of the most important trends in SEO right now clearly reflected, which is that Google is giving more and more real estate, especially in search, to AI overviews. When AI overviews first launched, and we had another recent webinar where we talked about this in great detail, essentially Google signaled or SEOs believed that AI overviews would not occur in health as often as they did in other topics. The opposite has happened. They're occurring more often in health than in other topics. And we see some of the signs here of what this means. We see that, number one, it favors large incumbent brands with high authority and good reputations. What are the entities that you see on the screen? Mayo Clinic, NIH, Northwestern Medicine. These are major, prominent, often .gov, .edu websites. A second thing we see is that there are not necessarily a lot of clicks necessary here, that if I'm just trying to understand what are my symptoms, there's not as much opportunity here for someone that's, say, selling a medical device to get my click and then to start pulling me into a funnel of moving through the stages on their site. I can have a pretty thorough understanding of the topic without a click. This has some implications, obviously, for any of the brands that are currently getting a lot of clicks from awareness stage queries. If that's you, you need to think about how you report against that. You also need to think about what your strategy is going to look like in a year or two, and AI search and both the opportunities and also what it costs you in terms of traffic needs to be a huge pillar of your strategy. As we move down that search engine results page, we see other, I think, meaningful signals here, which is that we see more large authoritative brands, right? We're still seeing WebMD, NIH, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic. But we see this other thing that Google likes to do on their platforms, both Google Search and YouTube, which is where they balance out a really sort of traditional vision of expertise and authority with another type of content, in this case, discussions and forums. So this, I think, makes it leads to the question: if you are, a brand that is not a Cleveland Clinic or Mayo Clinic or WebMD, what would it take to get mentioned or linked or cited by one like that if it's really important for you to have traffic around a certain symptom, certain condition, etc. If that's not exactly how you're looking at it, what would it take for you to show up in discussions and forums? If you've invested in trying to have kind of brand evangelists, trying to have outreach to a very specific community, is that translating to visibility in these kinds of discussions and forums, SERP features? So hopefully you can see some of the questions and opportunities that come up here when we look at Google search. When we turn to another platform and see what ChatGPT has to say about the symptoms of sleep apnea, it's actually pretty in line with Google search. We see a pretty similar set of brand names, or at least a similar sort of class of brands showing up in kind of the search GPT. So the ChatGPT kind of enhanced with the web results as we did in the Google search. So this is very similar. In some ways, this is even less likely to sort of let in challenger brands or for there to be a play here for awareness, high funnel type of queries in ChatGPT. We're not really seeing UGC, and we're certainly not, or forums, and we're certainly not seeing ads. So that's something to consider when we talk about AI search and what that means for different kinds of brands. Things get a little bit more varied when we go to YouTube, and I'll kind of walk you through how that plays out. When we look at just the most basic default search results here, YouTube is attempting to do what Google does, which is favor authoritative, established sources. We see practitioners and we see prominent brands like UC Health, Johns Hopkins. We also see some ads, and we see lots of potential real estate here for physicians or for any kind of authoritative healthcare provider to start maybe producing content on YouTube. These are not, when we look at the view counts, we look at the content quality, these are not unbeatable resources, especially if we have any sorts of folks with a public profile or with any sort of kind of charisma. that can make content, or we feel like we can win on quality. It gets a little bit more complicated though when we actually look at, this is when I sorted the search by most viewed. So when we look at what are the actual searches on the content on YouTube rather that's getting the most eyeballs, when we kind of get out of what YouTube is sort of trying to show us with more health verified sources. Number one, we see more ads. Number two, we see a TV ad having the largest views. And then when we have a result from a healthcare provider, it's telling a little bit of a counter narrative or a counter consensus narrative. And then when we poke around a little bit more in YouTube search and keep scrolling down, we have a bar of shorts, and we find that the most viewed piece of content in the whole YouTube ecosystem for sleep apnea is a Joe Rogan short that has many more times the views of any other piece of content, over 8 million views. So if we look beyond kind of just the most basic search results and actually ask the question of who is getting eyeballs and who is setting narratives on YouTube, YouTube is very dominated, very prone to be dominated by folks that are already really prominent, have a very large audience, and are getting millions and millions of eyeballs on everything they put out. When we see TikTok compared to YouTube, it's more diversified. And actually, I'm not going to talk a ton about TikTok in this presentation simply because for, I think, two reasons. Number one, it's kind of similar across all the stages. There isn't a huge difference in awareness versus consideration versus decision, the same way there is on other platforms. Number two, user journeys on TikTok are very idiosyncratic. This is what I get when I search TikTok, but not a lot of people are necessarily searching TikTok compared to just relying on their own FYP or just following links, clicking, scrolling, etc. But in general, when we think about TikTok, what do we see? We see lots of human faces. We see kind of a total free-for-all of lots of experts and lots of everyday people, lots of consensus views and non-consensus views. So we see a place where pretty much the whole spectrum of healthcare brands that we can imagine might have some kind of a play to make. It's just maybe a little bit harder to get a predictable ROI from it than some of the other platforms because of idiosyncratic user journeys and also demographic specific content. We can see that different people here in the way they style the language and the visual language of the video, their personal appearance, their visible identity, all those types of things. You can see how each of these figures might be more likely to get into a specific person's algorithm based on all those types of factors. So TikTok is, I think, very intriguing maybe for brands that can't play as easily in some of those platforms where established authority and established reputation matter more, but it also is more of a free-for-all and more of an idiosyncratic platform than the Google platforms or the Meta platforms. Finally, another platform that I'm not going to show a ton of examples of throughout the presentation, but it is important, is Pinterest. Similar to TikTok, Pinterest is pretty wide open and doesn't necessarily change that much as you move through the different stages. When we look at Pinterest, we see maybe even a wider variety of content than TikTok because while TikTok has a wide variety of individuals, you're seeing mostly just kind of human faces and pretty similar formats. Here on Pinterest, we see a really wide range of formats and styles. We see a mix of consensus and non-consensus views. I think there's a lot of possibility here for a challenger brand, especially a challenger brand with good creative, or maybe with a large content library of visual content or content that can be easily repurposed into static visuals to play here on Pinterest. Pinterest isn't as sexy as TikTok. It's not as well established as traditional SEO and Google. But you can see that there's still quite a bit of blue space here, quite a bit of opportunity to get a range of messages or a range of value propositions out on this channel. So when we look at all of that, and we try to kind of take it in and think about how we translate all those sort of facts about platform formats and algorithms we see in the table to actual strategy. When we actually start looking, okay, but what's actually happening on the user, what's the user actually seeing platform by platform? I think here is kind of how I would generalize it. Many different discovery platforms reward engagement and virality over traditional credibility. There are, however, still places where especially Google tries to privilege traditional expertise as long as it's expressed in a way that's legible to their algorithms. So brands must package trustworthy information in an engaging format to win attention. And I think, as you can kind of hopefully hear as I'm talking through what I read in the different interfaces and different screenshots, the size of your brand, the prominence of your brand, the extent to which you have a consensus versus non-consensus kind of story to tell are all going to affect which one of these platforms makes the most sense for you, which combination makes the most sense for you, and what things like trustworthy and engaging actually mean for your content strategy. Moving from there to the consideration phase, as with the awareness phase, I have a big table here that you can screenshot or you can kind of take with you when we send this. This is interesting because I think at the consideration stage, we probably see the widest range of different content types and formats competing for eyeballs, partly because we see promotional content and ads starting to get intermixed at a higher rate with more traditional informative content. So when you're looking on these video channels and the search channels alike, the traditional search channels, you'll see both sort of in-depth traditional expertise-based content and also ads and also more sort of maybe influencer style or kind of voicey content side by side. So there's a need at this stage to give clear, structured information, to be in question answering mode, to be in comparison mode, to be in process explanation mode. Um, at the same time, you have to recognize that you're responding to a pretty wide range of competitor value propositions that are also getting in front of the same eyeballs as you, and that you need to be thinking broadly about the other perspectives or the objections that your target user is encountering in their journey. There's a really wide range of formats and a really wide range of, I would say strategies and tactics at play in the consideration stage. And hopefully this becomes clear what I mean by this when we look closer at some of the user interface screenshots of the different platforms here. So starting in Google search again, if we search for best sleep apnea treatment, we see a lot of ads, and we see quite a different interface than what we saw when we're in the awareness stage. We're seeing less of the AI overviews and not just ads, but two different ad formats with all kinds of different value propositions and modifiers all on the screen. I see all kinds of different non-brand and brand language on the screen across all those ads. This could be a overwhelming experience for the user. And it could also be a situation where if I really want the best, I'm trying to kind of answer that question. There's a lot of things that are not necessarily answering that question in a factual way hitting me first. It kind of got cut off a little bit in the screenshot. We can see that Google is still trying to give a clear, definitive answer to this question in that featured snippet there at the bottom of the screenshot, where it's basically telling you, okay, the actual best is a CPAP machine. And this can be kind of the bipolar nature of Google, both on Google search and on YouTube. This is something you have to be thinking about with this new search landscape, that Google is trying to essentially have it both ways, where they want to be providing clear, expert, reliable information and answers to questions, and they need to sell advertising, and they need to have paths for a wide different range of formats because users of different generations and demographics respond to a pretty wide range of different creative and content. So Google is trying to do quite a balancing act in the consideration phase. That's, I think, very evident in both Google search and YouTube. When we keep moving down that searches and results page, we see kind of an interesting thing that I think highlights the complexity of search at the moment, and how many different things Google is trying, and you could also say Meta is trying in its sort of AI-based form, where they're trying to integrate AI into these really well-established platforms and interfaces. What we have here is we have a people also ask like FAQ question that ends up having an AI overview embedded within it. And we see, as we saw before, that the AI overview is really reliant on very prominent, very authoritative brands. So it's kind of, I think, a little bit of a disorienting experience for me to go from a lot of ads with a lot of different products on offer to basically making the case for a CPAP and like very sort of, .edu, .gov type of websites tending to rank. I think this interesting situation that people also ask AIO combination is that it shows the value for digital marketers of looking at FAQs, but doing more than just using a keyword tool to give you FAQs, actually looking at the variations and how those FAQs are being answered. I think sometimes people think that having an FAQ-based content strategy means just coming up with all the questions and getting some SME to answer them. There's more than that. There's a lot more to it than that. It's seeing variations in how the questions are answered and thinking a little bit, if we want to repurpose content, about what would an answer look like that would be as likely as possible to succeed in multiple different platforms. That's a hard question to answer. It has to be answered on a topic by topic, brand by brand level. But I hope this at least shows what a more sophisticated way to approaching FAQs might start to look like and the kind of research that you should be doing to inform that kind of strategy. Finally, as we kind of keep moving through this Google search page here, we see more very authoritative sites right by product listings. And in the product listings, we see, again, a wide range of different content in the sense that we have large e-commerce and specialized e-commerce side by side. We have multiple different classes or types of devices side by side. You can also start to see in the organic results there, that Harvard Health results, some non-consensus content. This is a theme for Google, where they tend to try to have a majority consensus content, but some non-consensus content integrated. I think if you're looking for a way, frankly, for a brand that is not already very prominent in Google to start playing on some high volume queries, non-consensus content is a way, especially when we look at the fact that non-consensus content is valued on platforms like YouTube and the short form video platforms. Some of that might be able to be repurposed back into Google in an interesting strategy for brands. When we look at ChatGPT, we see that they're pretty aligned with Google on what is the best treatment for sleep apnea, giving similar kind of information from similar types of sources. They're also incorporating some non-consensus material. We see that same Health.Harvard link there. And then something really interesting happens, right? Where they have this recent developments in sleep apnea feature. Just like we saw with the AI overviews and Google's People Also Ask result, this is a reflection of the fact that these platforms are experimenting a lot with how to integrate different information types, different levels of sort of freshness or recency of information into the interface, and that they're using AI to really aggressively run different experiments. This recent developments feature has a very idiosyncratic result. I think smart pajamas that monitor sleep apnea has not come up in any of the other searches we've looked at so far on this topic. And that's also likely acquired through PR. New York Post is a large digital publisher that does a lot of business through things like PR and affiliate. So that is a gettable spot, or at least a purchasable spot, for a brand that is maybe a challenger or has a new story to tell, and wants to think about ways into some of these traditional expertise-heavy search landscapes. On the short form video platforms, a lot of what we see is the same as it was the awareness stage, and that there's a really wide range of messages and content, but fundamentally the formats are going to be pretty kind of authentic, lo-fi, human face. This is a search from Instagram, which I think shows some kind of interesting features of Instagram compared to TikTok. A lot of what we see here is fairly consensus information. It's kind of heavy on the white coat, or I guess blue scrubs type of content, that this is something where, okay, if you're a more established healthcare brand or healthcare provider, that seems like territory where you could play, especially if you have physicians who are charismatic or people that are willing or interested in kind of building out that kind of profile for themselves. There's another interesting thing here going on, though, where the highest viewed piece of content in this little array is this video that has to do with Ozempic and GLP-1s. So that's not really sleep apnea treatment, but it is an adjacent topic that could speak to some of maybe the same underlying conditions or symptoms. And it's much more trendy, right, than anything to do with sleep apnea, and doing much bigger numbers. So you can kind of see how this is interesting when you think about what this means for the brands that are trying to promote a CPAP versus the brands that whoever is making and putting out this kind of Ozempic content. It creates some difficulties in narrow targeting on the short form video platforms for smaller brands, that if you're trying to talk about a very specific device class or very specific solution, things that are sort of adjacent are going to get pulled in because that's how the algorithm understands just the human behind the search. It also means that if you're the person putting out the larger audience piece of content on the short form video platforms, you're going to be pulled into all these kind of adjacent niches or rabbit holes. And that's something you need to be thinking about when you're looking at your reporting and maybe not always taking kind of top line engagement or view metrics at face value. The final screenshot I have here for the consideration stage is back on YouTube. We see more ads here than we saw in the awareness stage on YouTube. We also see that there are non-consensus views here. There's alternatives views. I think the final thing I would note about this is that there's plenty of room for healthcare providers here, that there are, kind of traditional healthcare providers, again, sort of white coats and scrubs style content. And I think that if you are working with a healthcare provider that has the ability to produce things like that, the bar for the quality, the style, the kind of, it does not have to be the most polished, slick, engaging piece of content in the world to compete in YouTube. YouTube is pretty open in the consideration stage in terms of what types of content is ranking and getting eyeballs. So takeaway here, there's a lot. It's hard to kind of sum it all up. But we can think about this stage basically as a stage where users are shifting from sort of passive scrolling, passive skimming, opening up lots of tabs to doing more active research. This is a stage where people are going to be more likely to click and to be engaging critically with what they do or don't click on. So the most effective content at this stage is going to be educational, but also engaging. It's going to be balancing that depth with clarity and with giving people a sense that their question has been answered. And I think that we see examples of how brands can do that well across platforms. We also see examples of places where what works in short-form video isn't necessarily going to work reliably elsewhere. I think the last thing I'd really know about this stage is that ads and counter consensus messages can start to stand out in this phase as well. So if you're a brand that has a kind of different story to tell or a new story to tell, I think a smart consideration stage strategy that has a good understanding of the questions users are answering and the nuance questions users are asking, there we go, and the nuances in how they're being answered. You can play here and you can play to win. I think also ads, frankly, if you are having trouble with organic performance and need to start kind of purchasing more relatively qualified traffic, a smart strategy that targets this stage can be a powerful tool for the job there. Okay, so moving finally into the decision stage and starting to think about what are the themes of this stage? How does it differ from the other stages? This stage, I think, actually starts to differ quite a lot. When we see all of these different platforms, we really see, I think, if we were to put kind of total numbers on this, that Google and other interfaces that are pretty similar to Google still dominate, especially when people are looking for ambulatory healthcare or localized results. That Google has, is out ahead of other platforms and just being the place that people go when they're looking to find something local. On the other platforms, there is still opportunities for a traditional healthcare provider to kind of tell their story and get out there. But we do see kind of a diminished ability to offer localized or really kind of action-oriented content that gets reliable results on some of the video-based platforms. So I think some of the pertinent features here become clear when we look again at some kind of screenshots and representative examples. So on Google, if I'm trying to find an actual kind of in-person healthcare option, traditional healthcare option, I'm in Portland, Oregon, and it's quite clear that I'm getting localized results and I'm getting localized ads. This is hopefully pretty familiar territory to anyone who works in ambulatory healthcare marketing. You know the ad types, your geo-targeting options. Hopefully you have a local SEO strategy and you can kind of be monitoring carefully how well it plays out. We see in the Maps interface, probably one of the most familiar interfaces anywhere on the web, up there with Craigslist and Wikipedia and such. People are very used to seeing the Google Maps interface. They're very used to navigating it. It's very high volume, very familiar, very well-established patterns. We see here that there's more ads showing up. And we also see that both large and kind of niche specialized HCPs are really competing. And we see that the largest kind of incumbents, the folks that are really doing well here, have a lot of reviews and very well optimized profiles. And that, like, of all the areas that have been disrupted or not by changes in AI and by the shifting nature of the platforms, local search has been a little bit more stable and a place where kind of long-term by the book investments are still paying off for folks. I think one thing that's interesting to think about the decision phase, though, is how folks might have a user journey that isn't quite so simple as just necessarily resolving to looking at localized search for ambulatory healthcare. So I think one thing that's really interesting to play with for your specific brand or your specific area is to look at ChatGPT and see what happens when you kind of ask it about options, right? Is it directing you towards a doctor? Is it directing you towards a device? Is it directing you towards something else? I think this, ChatGPT result I got seems to come down in favor of getting an appointment, which is sort of interesting considering how many different either sort of self-diagnosis or e-commerce options we've seen throughout all the different journeys on the platforms. ChatGPT is going to guide you in this specific case towards a real life appointment with an HCP. I think that this is something to be very aware of in healthcare search. When folks aren't quite sure what the final decision in a decision stage is, but they're trying to move towards it. What are the kind of more interactive platforms, LLMs, chatbots, other kind of question and answer formats? What are they directing you towards? We also see something really interesting in ChatGPT that if you kind of continue this journey, so say, okay, I do want to go to the doctor. Where should I go? I live in Portland. It gives me what looks on the surface like a very familiar interface, a Google Maps style interface, but it's notable here, although this is, by the way, probably pulling in from Bing, not from Google, obviously. But it's notable here that it's a different top ranking set than Google. So those folks that have really invested in their Google Maps local SEO discoverability strategy are up against a different landscape and a different kind of set of winners here. That's something that really bears analysis and consideration for any folks who are trying to boost decision stage KPIs for ambulatory healthcare, especially. A lot of the short form video platforms don't have a lot that's really too distinct or easy to leverage, I would say, in the area of kind of decision compared to other stages. YouTube is sort of interesting, and something I did want to highlight is that YouTube doesn't provide a lot of really clearly localized content when I search for something to do with actual in-person ambulatory healthcare. There is one ad that talks about Portland, and there's one video that mentions Portland, but that video is a local news segment. It's pretty lo-fi, and it's not necessarily as transactional or directing me right towards an appointment booking with that specific person or anything like that. The other content I'm seeing here isn't necessarily localized, or it just feels like it's still a few steps removed from me actually being able to make a decision. So I think that if you are trying to get more traction with decision stage traffic and search and social, I think YouTube is very appealing because we see that YouTube wants to rank a local HCP, but at least in this particular instance, there's at least a bit of a dearth of good content for that. So I think for local HCPs, especially specialized clinics and niche providers, there's a lot of room to play on YouTube, and it's a very interesting platform for this specific type of content at this specific stage. So our takeaways here: as users draw closer to submitting forms or booking appointments, trust and credibility start to matter most. Sometimes that means localization. Users are seeking verified information, again, often localized results. Google is still have a pretty solid grip on the market here and also has sort of set expectations and interfaces. And that is going to play the biggest role for a lot of folks. But when we start looking at YouTube, or maybe depending on what kind of service or products you're offering, looking at certain parts of the short form video platforms, there are some places I think where they aren't just kind of saturated with really good content from the biggest brands. There's room to maneuver. And if you are in traditional ambulatory healthcare, a good local SEO strategy still matters quite a bit, but you may need a different one for ChatGPT than you have for traditional Google. All right, so moving now into some big ideas about cross-platform strategy. How do you take everything I've just talked about and synthesize it together in an actual approach? Big idea number one, we want to align content with user intent by platform. That's basically everything we've just been talking about. We see how things are different stage by stage, platform by platform. The savvy strategist is going to say kind of what's our leverage as a brand? What kind of creative do we have that's the best? What perspective do we have? Are we an incumbent? Are we a challenger? And they're going to be able to kind of do everything we see on the screen here in a way that's tailored to their specific brand and their specific opportunity. Another really big pillar here that we haven't talked about so much in this webinar, but is very important to keep in mind, I think, is to remember marketing fundamentals. We're living in an age of disruption and diversification. That's the whole premise of this webinar, and it's something that everyone who works in digital marketing is thinking about most days of the week at this point. But what that really means is that I think instead of trying to catch every trend or surf every wave, we want to try to get back to marketing fundamentals. And at Wheelhouse, these are ones we talk about a lot with clients. Know your audience, pay attention to them, talk to them. Don't assume they're static, don't assume they're complacent. Their digital world is changing too. How are they responding to that? Build your brand. We see pretty clearly in a lot of Google interfaces and AI-powered interfaces that brands with strong, distinct POV, brands that have made smart investments in PR are winning. And those are things that take time, and it's not something you can just do overnight. But if you have been maybe really invested in paying for performance and not as invested in building your brand, that might need to be rebalanced for you to have a good shot to play your best hand, so to speak, in this new paradigm. I think the final big idea here is to make things easy, to invest as much as you can in having really good UX. So when you do acquire traffic, people are experiencing an easy, logical design that isn't too frustrating, makes it pretty straightforward for them to complete the task they're going to complete. The final pillar I'd say here for winning cross-platform strategy is to ensure that you're approaching everything with an eye towards credibility and compliance. We're in healthcare, that means we can't play too fast and loose, and we might see opportunities for campaigns or for content types that might undermine our authority or that might put us in compliance risk. So I think it's important to be disciplined about using verified sources and citations and leveraging certified medical experts. Lots of large platforms are trying in various ways to reward this kind of content, and I don't think you can lose in the long term by really trying to make sure that your content is substantive and has verifiable expertise to back it up. I think the EAT principles, Google's experience, expertise, authority, and trust, are good, flexible principles to be thinking about across all platforms, as long as you can have a nuanced understanding of how they get expressed in each platform, what a type of experience that's legible to the algorithm looks like in Google search versus YouTube versus TikTok, etc. The last point here is to stay ahead of regulatory changes. Part of your job as a digital marketer in healthcare is to be very in tune with regulatory changes, what they imply for your campaigns and for your tracking. You're going to have a better and more sustainable ability to create a winning content strategy across platforms if you also have a robust first-party data strategy. If you own your data, you're confident in fidelity of the data, and you have easy access to data to maybe either repurpose into content or into market research or a variety of other things, you're going to be better prepared. And if you're trying to compete in a pretty dynamic and challenging marketing environment without a good data strategy at the foundation of it, you're going to be in trouble, especially in a situation where compliance can severely limit or change what's possible on any platform, as we've seen in the last several years. So those are big ideas, but also I think it's important to focus a little bit on what can you do tomorrow. If you're trying to just kind of get a shovel in at this point, number one, audit your content. This is a simple, straightforward thing to do. It does not take all the skill in the world. It just takes some elbow grease and in some cases, some clever use of AI. A simple spreadsheet where you audit content by its quality level, its topic, its format, and its potential, just kind of qualitatively assessed for repurposing or updating. That can at least give you something to lean on and make all of your conversations and strategizing around this a little bit less hypothetical. have a better understanding of what you have to leverage and what constraints you have in your existing content library. Number two, begin user research. If you are not talking to your users, if you're not getting their feedback on things like creative, value propositions, landing pages, that is going to severely limit you because there's a lot of content you see across platforms where it's not immediately intuitive why people like it or trust it, especially if you're used to a pretty traditional marketing, environment. When you look at Pinterest or when you look at short form video platforms, it might seem a little hard to parse. User research can help you get a much clearer, more actionable sense of what people like and trust and why, and where your kind of opportunities and weaknesses are in your current strategy. Number three, I think you can design an AI-powered repurposing pilot project. This is something that can seem to have a huge barrier to entry, getting up set up on repurposing workflows. But I'm here to tell you that I am not hugely technical, and I believe that it is pretty doable to have a kind of hackathon or just one person experimenting and developing a way to either actually do the content repurposing or to create kind of guidelines for it or to design another process for it or whatever else using LLMs. So if you can be, again, in pilot project mode, think about how to kind of have a good first iteration, whether that's starting with a specific channel, a specific content type, or specific topic, and basically think about how can I use the LLMs to either transform content or identify the best possible path for me to do so. That's a great opportunity to start working on something that realistically is going to be part of all of our careers as digital marketers for the entire foreseeable future. If you feel like you're a little bit behind on this, I would say, don't worry, it's very easy to start kind of working on it. And the LLMs are very good at content repurposing and reformatting. And also, they're not bad at explaining to you how to use them to do those kinds of things. So if you feel like you're totally facing a blank slate here, asking LLMs for help or for first steps for ideas or whatever else is one way to start moving towards something actually useful. So the final takeaway for me from all that, when we talk about all the different nuances of how the platforms function, and we also think about the patient journey, the key to success is really going to be to synthesize those types of things, those two things together, to have a fine-tuned idea of what works and what doesn't work on each platform, and to map that against where in the user journey you think you have the most need or most opportunity. And we see that brands, clients of ours that are able to optimize their content accordingly are getting their kind of maximum potential performance. And they're doing so in a way that reinforces engagement and trust instead of just being purely transactional. I think that's the beautiful thing always about good strategy is it creates virtuous cycles. I think there's a big opportunity to do that here if you can develop a content strategy that is well informed about what's going on platform by platform, and that makes a savvy set of choices about where you can play and how you can play efficiently. Okay, so with that, I'm going to transition now into Q&A. I think Grace has some questions, and we're going to start with a small set of questions or things we've heard from clients recently. We figured if clients are asking about these things, folks are probably in the audience, but they're probably asking about them too. So I'm going to start with those questions. And for this first one here, I can just read this. I think Grace has some others that have come up in the chat or that have an email to her as well. So this is something I've heard from clients. Basically, if we're seeing diminishing returns on organic search, what's the best channel for us to start experimenting with? Pretty straightforward. A lot of folks feel like the organic search traffic's declined in the last couple of years. So where do they go from there? First, I'd say if you feel like you're seeing diminishing returns in organic search, make sure that you're looking at that in terms of business value metrics, not just traffic metrics. But let's say that you're both seeing less traffic and less business value from organic search. The short answer to this is probably YouTube. I think that's the place where I feel like there's a lot of room to maneuver, a lot of different types of content doing well, and where high quality content and long form content can be repurposed in a pretty wide variety of formats. It's also the place where we see brands of different shapes and sizes doing well. So I see YouTube as just a flexible platform where probably the widest possible set of different brands are going to be able to at least get some value maybe they haven't captured yet, and are going to be able to do so with similar approaches, similar content types that are already doing well or have done well in the past in organic. Second question here, very much top of mind for folks. How should we account for the risk of a ban or other significant disruption of TikTok considering our social discovery strategy? It's been a big narrative in the last several years that young folks especially are using TikTok more and more, that TikTok's sort of a new search engine. But then what happens if it goes away or is significantly diminished? I would say that if you feel like short form video is a place where you can be strong, where it fits your overall brand strategy, it fits your demos, then you should invest in short form video. And then even if TikTok goes away, Instagram and YouTube, so therefore, Meta and Google are very invested in short form video. And short form video can also be a good way to maybe see a little bit more quickly some other channels, what sinks and what rises and what doesn't resonate with your audience. It's also can be a way to solicit UGC. So there's a lot of affordances to short form video that are not unique to TikTok and will not go away if TikTok goes away. And if TikTok doesn't go away, you'll look smart for not being too scared off and for being willing to invest in it in a way that makes sense for you. Last question here that I've heard recently, can we realistically compete in YouTube and social without influencers or public figures being featured in our content? I think the answer to this is yes. Social does not just equate to influencer. Also, I think realistically, if you are a large brand with a millions and millions of dollars of marketing budget, growing your own influencers or creating mutually beneficial and not purely transactional partnerships with influencers should be in your toolbox anyway. But I think there's lots of ways that people can respond to authentic human stories or to medical expertise that aren't totally dependent on somebody already having a large built-in audience. If you're going for the largest possible set of eyeballs as quickly as possible, you got to be realistic about the role that public figures and influencers play. But there's plenty of opportunity without it just being reduced to you have to do influencer to succeed in these channels. All right, so if we have questions from the Q&A chat, we can get to those now. I think, Grace, you had a couple. I maybe saw some coming in as well that we can talk about now. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to be cognizant of time. We have about 5 minutes here. So if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer, please drop them in the Q&A box. We did have some come through here, Joe. Let's see. All right, so this has to do with diversification of the social landscape. How do you decide what platform is worth your time and money, especially when there are so many new ones hitting the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one answer is, user research. I think, or you could say maybe more generally, like knowing your ideal customer, knowing your target demos. Sometimes it's just that simple. I think in other ways, though, you can also think about what your brand has to leverage, right? Do you have really strong human stories? Do you have really eye-catching research, and then kind of working back from there to what formats your assets lend themselves to, and what platforms those formats are most likely to do well on. So you can either kind of start with the user or start with what you have to work with. And either way, I think using the kind of resources we provided in this presentation of those tables, and then also just doing your own research and seeing what's winning for the most relevant types of searches and user journeys. It really can just be a matter of kind of critical thinking and very straightforward research to start to piece it together. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here. What is a good data source to figure out what people are searching for on YouTube?
That's a very good question. I think so. I think with YouTube, there are third-party tools that will give you volume, but I actually think, like in Google, for example, like if I'm looking at keyword volume, I would rather be able to see traffic volume, the keyword volume, right? Like instead of seeing a generic number of search volume, I would like to be able to see which sites actually got which clicks, and I'd like to be able to maybe start to hypothesize a bit about which types of users gave which things traffic. So I actually think for YouTube, what I would usually do is do kind of an aggregate set of searches and then actually look at view counts. And I think that is going to get you a little bit closer to actionable business decisions to be able to say, when we search around the topic of sleep apnea, these specific videos or these types of videos are getting X amount of views, Y amount of views, and to kind of hypothesize from there. So in general, like I think I'm always trying to move away from gigantic eyeball numbers and towards more like finely tuned hypotheses about who exactly is doing what exactly. And I think again, just like looking at view counts and do some critical thinking can give you that without needing to pay for a third-party tool. And that's one of the things that is nice about YouTube and makes it more approachable, especially for folks with small budgets. Yeah.
Well, thank you. All right, one more question here. Given the ever-changing state laws and HIPAA compliance, how can we continue to
Yeah.
run compliant site retargeting strategies? Since that's
Mm.
historically successful.
Yeah, that's a really good question that I think is, to be honest, a little bit up in the air right now. I was just on a call a few hours ago with a client that is having some major readjustments due to changes in meta regulations. Um, I think that there probably isn't unfortunately, like a super quick blanket answer to that, in my opinion, because I do think you need to be advised by people that um, are really in touch with the platform reps, and in some cases, like getting platform reps to commit to things. But I would say, like, if you have a really specific problem you're trying to solve there, like, reach out and like I think our advertising folks would be happy to chat. Um, I think in general, the what I'm seeing folks do is to try to just be relatively nimble with their spend, and to recognize that maybe like CPL metrics that have looked really, really good are not forever, and that maybe attention paid to the quality of creative, to testing creative, attention paid to how well landing experiences line up with ad copy. That maybe if folks have maybe tuned those up as well as they might have, or kept a close eye on them as well as they might have, as long as CPL targets were being hit on large, easy to manage platforms. So I think there isn't really a substitute for having someone that's really in it every day and working with reps on the platform is managing, and helping you assess these questions. But that is hopefully an impetus to start paying attention to just kind of quality of creative, alignment with audience, CRO and landing experiences, especially if you've been neglecting those kinds of things and just been happy to pay for what seems like good performance. Sorry, that's not a like super incisive answer. I don't want to give a falsely, blanket answer that just sounds good, but doesn't solve all the problems, because I am on calls with people who are very smart and spending a lot of money and trying really hard to figure some of this stuff out, and it is not easy, and there are trade-offs. So yeah, not the most satisfying answer, but definitely something that Wheelhouse would be happy to chat more with in a helpful, non-transactional way if you're feeling an urgent problem and just want to kind of get in our kind of candor about what we're seeing from some of our folks that are actually working on that day in and day out. So yeah.
Thank you, Joe. We do have a few more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. So we'll be reaching out individually and making sure that we can get answers to you, because this has started a really good conversation, I think, here. So Joe, if you don't mind hitting next on the slide, I do want to share our contact information so that if you do have any further questions or want to talk more about any specific topics or how maybe we can even help you, feel free to reach out either to our general contact or to Joe himself.
Great.
Right.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I appreciate the engagement, and hopefully some of this is helpful, and we can definitely either answer questions or refer you to people that can, if there's anything that came up that you'd like to discuss more. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, and a recording of the webinar will be going out within the next 3 business days, so you can look for that to hit your inbox shortly. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.